I have this unique position between BrightInsight and our corporate flex where we sit at the crossroads of a lot of different industries and get to see how they're transforming. And within healthcare, we're lucky enough to work with 80% of the largest biopharma and medtech companies in the world. And so we have this great perch on which to see what's happening and what's happening well, and what the lessons are from both those things that are working as well as those things that aren't. And so I'm going to try to capture and share some of those with you today. Before I jump into that, I'm just going to take one slide, do a quick introduction as context of BrightInsight for those of you that are not as familiar. BrightInsight, we're the leading medical grade IoT platform. So what we are is basically we integrate into any medical device, whether that's an app, an algorithm, connected drug delivery device, a wearable, implantable, et cetera. And we take responsibility for all the privacy, security, and regulatory requirements of getting the data off the patient and into the cloud, then turning that data into insight and putting it back as a recommendation back to the patient, back to the provider, et cetera. One of the most unique features about what we manage for our customers is we operate under a quality management system that supports all the way up to class 3 and combination product intended uses. So we literally don't write a piece of software code outside of that QMS end-to-end for everything that we do. So it's a really big distinction for the highly regulated industry we operate in, and a big distinction versus other solutions that are MDDS based quality management systems. And what that enables us to do is really be agnostic to how we support digital health innovation. So as I mentioned, we support any type of product, we support any type of disease area, and we support any market that you want to operate in. So our customer base is really a broad set of pharma and medtech companies. And as hopefully many of you saw at the late last year, Novo Nordisk was gracious enough to go public with us in a joint press release that really highlighted that they're leveraging BrightInsight as their regulated digital health platform for all of their innovation, including the Bluetooth insulin pens that they're working on. So we're doing that with them on a global scale. I'm also happy to announce today that we've established a partnership with Boston Consulting Group and Boston Consulting Group Digital Ventures, where we'll be able to go jointly to our clients and help them really leverage BCG/DV's 1,000 digital experts to help build, commercialize, and scale digital health innovation on top of the BrightInsight platform. And then the last thing I'll say is you may have caught, but we just had our press release go live at 8 a.m. this morning that we just launched a product for Roche. So that's a big achievement. Somebody was pointing out that the exciting thing when she heard the story was that end-to-end, this was a 5-month project. Roche came to us wanting to do this drug dosing calculator, and from the day the SOW was signed to when they launched in their first country was a 5-month project. And to us, that's what this is about, is how to really accelerate and scale digital health. So thank you. So that's it on BrightInsight. Let me now jump into the main things I wanted to cover with everybody here. Just what are some of the lessons we're learning? And really 4 points that I want to try to highlight. The first is, what are the perils of developing solutions in a silo? Right? And Don referred to this a little bit yesterday. But we fundamentally are seeing it that integration is key to really being successful in driving scale. And I'll give some external examples of that to try to help make that very real. But then I will try to come back to some of the observations we're seeing early days, but companies starting to take approaches that we think make a lot of sense, a really ecosystem-based approach to digital innovation. And then lastly, we want to have a conversation about how do we empower everybody in this room so that when you go back to your companies and you see these silo-type decisions, how do you combat that? Because I think it's a responsibility that you all have to be able to do that, so that that what you're doing for your patients and your shareholders really is going to deliver that value. So this is a bit of an obvious statement, but I think an important one, right? Which is just because you're developing technology doesn't mean you're doing it right. And there's a lot of examples of that, and I'll click us through a couple of them. So let's see a show of hands. Who has a built-in GPS in their car? Who drives a car where it came with that? Okay. Now, keep your hands up if that's what you use as your GPS versus your phone. Yeah. So literally, I don't see a single hand still up. So this is the actual real-world data. Let's just pause and think about this for a second. For a decade, a full decade, the auto industry invested literally hundreds of millions of dollars, I think over $1 billion, to create GPSs, right? This was the #1 investment for their customer-facing software investment that they were doing. So they spent a decade, hundreds of millions of dollars working on this type of technology. It's in virtually every car. It was all over TV. The dealers were trying to have you upgrade on it, right? And now, literally in the world, less than 5% of people use the GPS in their cars, right? So like, to me, it's an amazing case study because you literally had this as such a high priority. Hey, we're doing digital. Hey, we're doing technology. Yeah, you have something that clearly was not successful. So why is that? Clearly, it's not because we all prefer to use paper maps, because I assume if I ask for a show of hands, nobody's still on paper. Well, the reason is that they made a set of fundamental mistakes, and I actually see this happening today in pharma and medtech as well. So first is they were innovating at the pace of their underlying product. So they were doing software innovation at the pace of cars. A new car comes out every 7 years, right? We know drugs are 10 to 12 as an example. Cars are 7. Well, you can't do software innovation at that pace. So by the time their GPSs came out, the user experience, the content, everything was outdated. People didn't want to use that. They just went through 7 versions of the iPhone. And how are you going to keep up with that if you started 7 years ago with that innovation? Second thing that they did is that they did this in a silo. They didn't think about the fact that how is somebody actually going to interface with that technology? And the reality is we all look up where we want to go on your phone or computer through Google Maps or Apple Maps before you get into your car. And now you get into your car and you say, well, now I got to re-plug in where I want to go. And then what's the next thing you're going to do? And you say, well, do these directions even match? And then you got to go through the mental friction of deciding which path you're going to follow. And then you actually drive. So you're actually creating friction in people's lives. And then think about, well, what's the ecosystem of my user? And how do I solve this problem from their perspective, not my perspective as the car OEM, right? Another example, let's talk about TV. So if you, again, look back over the last 7 to 10 years, the television companies, the cable companies, they thought they were doing a lot of disruptive digital innovation, right? We went from having about 30 or 40 channels to 100-plus channels for most cable networks, right? You went from being able to record one show to being able to record multiple shows at once. You can watch on your sofa, you can go continue it in your bedroom. So they thought they were driving meaningful digital innovation. But it was really incremental, and you see it when you look at the example of Netflix. Right? So Netflix, especially when streaming came along, they completely changed everything. Well, what's the first thing they did? The first thing they said is, it's all about what content you want to watch. It's not about 100 TV channels being on. It's literally thousands of available content that you can watch when you want. And then the second big innovation was the cable companies couldn't get out of the mindset that our product is used when you're sitting on the sofa. And what Netflix said is, well, why do we have to have that constraint? Let's think about the ecosystem of our users. Well, their ecosystem is they want to ingest content anytime, anywhere, on any device, right? Whether you're on your commute home on the train, whether you are hanging out in the bathroom, whether you are at work, you should be able to ingest that content where you want, when you want. And so they completely solved that problem in a very, very different way, right? And you see that still playing out today. Just last year, Netflix still had 31 million subscribers. You see DirecTV lost 3 million subscribers. And some of you may know DirecTV, they try to catch up. They launched their own essentially streaming service, and even that is already losing customers after an initial gain. So this will end up being literally AT&T's probably worst financial transaction ever, was to buy DirecTV at exactly the wrong time. And I'll just take us through one last example here to learn from. So let's talk about banking. So who here, again, show of hands, downloads and uses their bank's app? Like Citibank, whatever bank, okay. So it seems like about half the crowd, that's about right. Okay, now keep your hands up if you use that banking app, that same banking app, to send money to friends, family, et cetera. Okay, so again, that's about the right data, which is that about 10 to 15% of folks use their bank's app in order to send data. It's actually, for most banks, a lot of friction to be able to do that. They're gradually getting better at it, but they essentially took the same experience of writing a check and they made it into a not so great digital experience, which is if I want to send money to one of you, typically you have to now go create an account in order to receive that money. And then you need to link that account to your bank for the money to get there, right? And then comes along Venmo, right? And Venmo says, again, this is not about ecosystem. We're going to solve this in an ecosystem way. We want to enable anybody who knows anybody to be able to send money to each other and make it really easy to do. So you have to do one point of integration. I integrate with my bank. After that, anybody else who I want to send money to, I just send it to their Venmo account. It doesn't matter who their bank is at the back end, right? And again, you see Venmo is one of the largest drivers of PayPal's valuation today. They're continuing to grow at breakneck speed. They've literally, even with these big numbers, they've literally quadrupled in the last 2 years in terms of number of users and dollars going through. And the other interesting thing is we all care about engagement is people use their Venmo app about 10 times more often than they use their banking app, right? So again, sort of the level of engagement that they're being able to create. So what does all that mean? Both in terms of the key lesson here, it's about integration. I want you to think about integration in a broader sense, which is the integration of data. It's about the integration of experience, right? It's the integration of how do my users live their lives and what's the ecosystem that they're living in that I'm relevant, and how do I integrate and become a part of that, right? And so within healthcare, this matters for all your customers, providers, payers, as well as of course patients, right? So let's just click through that very briefly. And I think there's no data here that I would imagine anybody in this room is going to be surprised about, right? But the average doctor has not enough time to see that patient. Yet, from my vantage point, we see companies that are still investing to build physician portals, right? Which, again, let's pause and think about that, especially outside of the R&D environment. You literally have a doctor who has not enough time to see that patient. You might have this amazingly important information that you want to get to that doctor, but you cannot expect them to minimize their EMR screen, remember your website, launch that, remember the login, the unique login they have to create for your website, then go through all the privacy requirements to get that data for that specific patient that's in their office right there for them to make a better decision. No matter the importance of the innovation you're driving, if it does not integrate into the clinical workflow of the doctor, it's not going to ever scale, right? So just have to think about that piece up front when you're making those massive investments around, hey, how are we going to create value? How are we going to create improve outcomes at scale? You've got to think and talk about the ecosystem integration with the doctor. On the payers and disease management side, this area is actually really exciting to me now because having spent a reasonable amount of time myself in biopharma, I'm finally now beginning to see that the conversations aren't only about tussling over prices. Those are obviously still there, but now we're seeing meaningful conversations where payers and disease management programs, and we'll have a whole panel on this later today, are discussing how do we unlock data to do two things fundamentally. One is how do we unlock data from digital solutions in order to improve disease management programs, right? So the example here would be the payer or the disease management program is largely relying on delayed data. It's coming from claims and other sources. But if we can be getting real-time data off a smart device, that can really inform their ability to figure out who they need to intervene in, how do they intervene, et cetera, right? So that ecosystem conversation is becoming very real, and we're seeing a lot of examples of that, and I think it'll come up probably in a couple of discussions today. The other thing that we're sort of learning is what I would call almost the second generation of value-based care is, and we had my own experiences with this, is there was this big push to how do we contract for beyond the pill, right? We don't want to just get paid for every time a script gets filled. We want to get paid for performing. Well, those contracts and the energy came, some of these contracts came, and then they started falling apart because you got to know how to adjudicate them. So if you can't track adherence, how can you have a contract that pays somebody for adherence, right? And this is a fundamental problem that exists today that finally we're beginning to see payers trying to address, which is say, hey, look, we still want to do value-based care. We want to actually accelerate it, but we got to be able to have an ability to get that data and get it in a way that it integrates into our ecosystem to drive that adjudication. But from their perspective, and this is came out really loud and clear in the white paper that you guys have in your bags there. We just published this week with LEK. We did some joint research with them on pharma, medtech, digital innovation from the payer perspective. And one of the key insights, sort of obvious but important again, is they're not interested in integrating with each pharma and medtech company's solution because it's just not practical for them, right? So their notion is, hey, we want to integrate into the ecosystem, but not have 100-point solutions with each pharma and medtech company. So how do we really think about unlocking that data for both disease management and value-based care in a way that's really scalable and operational from an IT perspective, from a security perspective, et cetera. And then again, I think this won't be a surprise to anybody in this room, but certainly we still see it all the time when we're working with customers, which is the notion of people approaching their patient as if their patient, they're the only part of their patient's therapy, right? And just think about your drugs and devices. How many of your patients literally get the entire solution just from you? It doesn't matter what disease area you're in, the percentages is typically in the low single digits, where somebody with a chronic condition is only using one company or for all of their therapy and or diagnostic needs, right? And so how is it that it's a good thing for them if you create a siloed solution where they're only interfacing with one part of their therapy and they don't have visibility and understanding what's going on with the rest of the portfolio of medicines that's helping them. So again, obvious, but we see this happening all the time today in the types of digital health innovation that companies are investing in. So before we jump into a couple of examples of where I think folks are beginning to make much more thoughtful approaches doing it, I just want to sort of give a quick visual when you think about this. So if you build a digital health solution, you got to think about how am I going to integrate that into literally I think 800 or so payers, just the United States alone, the 6,000 disease management programs in the U.S., 5,000 hospital and provider systems in the U.S., right? So it's literally not tenable to create a solution and then take the responsibility to now go integrate that into the broader ecosystem. But you got to think about that up front before you spend all the tens of millions of dollars and years in innovating that solution. So as I sort of alluded to, I'm excited to talk about a couple of examples where I think to me are really exciting because they're beginning to show what the possibilities is when you take the right approach. So at BrightInsight and at Flex, we're lucky enough to work with a lot of the leading diabetes companies in the world, both from startups to the drug side to the device side. And this is a space where we're beginning to see a pretty significant shift to taking more of an ecosystem approach, right? And one example here is this notion of when a patient becomes dependent on insulin, it typically takes a patient up to about almost 3 years in the United States and over 2 years to get to the right dosing for them, for that individual. And that happens not because of a limitation of science. That happens because you see your doctor every 3 or 4 months, and so they're going to gradually adjust the dosing to get you to the right dose over that period of time. But how do we unlock the power of science instead of sort of being limited by the fact that you only see your doctor several times a year? Well, you can do that with an algorithm that ingests data from glucose monitors and then runs an algorithm and tells somebody, well, let me tell you every few days how to adjust your dose. And there, the science shows that you can get somebody to the right drug dosing in a matter of several months instead of several years. So you just think about the clinical value of that, right? The end organ damage that you're saving somebody over that multiple years of being not appropriately controlled. So we're seeing an example here where diabetes companies are working on these algorithms, but they're taking a very broad approach to ingesting the data, right? They're recognizing that they can't just work with one or two of the glucose monitors companies, but they really have to take an ecosystem approach and create infrastructure where they can invite all of the major glucose monitoring companies to integrate into so that they can ingest the data, run their algorithm regardless of what device that patient is using. And then the same thing on the recommendation side. They recognize the value here isn't just to tell a patient how much insulin they should be taking, but you got to let the patient let that data go to whoever's supporting that patient, specifically the disease management programs. So again, this company is taking this really thoughtful approach where the patient can unlock in a secure way and send that data to their disease management program so they can use that information. So they have the glucose data, they have the activity and diet data, but now they also have the drug dosing data to have a much more holistic approach to how do we effectively manage that patient, right? So again, I think early days, but a really good example here of this industry saying it's got to be about taking an ecosystem approach, not us creating an end-to-end silo with our patients. It just doesn't make sense. In diabetes, again, I think the number is less than 5% of patients that rely on one drug company for all of their therapies. Give you an example on a very different side, on the oncology side. So, one of the surprises to me when I came to Flex and with BrightInsight actually has been the amount of activity on the digital health side in oncology. I had a bias actually that more of digital health was going to be focused purely on chronic diseases, but we're actually seeing a tremendous amount of energy in oncology, and part of that is to try to make cancer more of a chronic disease than an acute one. And the example I'll talk about here is in the CAR T space. So many of you are probably familiar with this incredibly innovative approach to cancer therapy. The short of it here is that it's about a $500,000 therapy. It's about another $1 million of healthcare costs. So you literally have $1.5 million that go into treating an individual patient with this, again, groundbreaking therapy is often curative. But they come with an unfortunate side effect risk called cytokine release storm. And in the small percentage of patients that get that, it could be fatal. And so tracking this and finding it early is really critical, right? And drug programs have been shut down in clinical trials because of this issue. So it's very real. Well, today the standard of care is you get this $1.5 million of therapy, and then you go home with a $2 thermometer to look for this catastrophic adverse event. Right? So clear opportunity to try to take a much more patient-centric, holistic approach to helping them track this, right? And so what we're seeing is companies begin to work with and say, okay, well, let's put a sensor on them. Right? And I think the easy thing to do here would be to say, hey, we're just going to put a sensor on them, and then we're going to track it, and then we'll try to figure out if this person is having cytokine release storm. But this company is taking a much more thoughtful approach. They're saying, we got to think about the broader ecosystem of who's really managing that patient. And so they're doing it in two areas that I want to really highlight. The first is on the sensor side. So I think the wrong approach would be, let's pick the best sensor, and then we're going to lock and load only that one. What they're recognizing is that hardware is going to continue to evolve. And the sensor that's the right one for me under my arm might be a different one for the next patient who wants to wear it somewhere else. The feel of it, the adhesive, the et cetera. You've got to have flexibility in that. So they're building an approach that is flexible to the device that's going to give them the core body temperature reading, and let that evolve over time as they get better and better. And on the other end of it, what they're saying is, hey, when we get this insight, this person needs to be evaluated. They're showing early risks of cytokine release storm. What do you do with that information? Again, the initial conversations, and luckily the thinking has evolved, was, okay, well, we got to alert the physician. We got to alert the patient. Well, they've taken a different approach, which is, let's empower the patient and the physician to decide when and how they want to ingest this data. So they've understood that, hey, we don't just push this out as a text message or a phone call to a physician. What we do is we let the physician practice choose. If you're a mom and pop small physician practice, they might want exactly that. The physician wants an immediate text or a phone call. But if you're a large oncology practice, you may want this information to go to whoever's going to be on call. It might be a nurse practitioner, maybe somebody else in the system. They should choose. And they should choose whether I'm getting a text message, am I getting an email, am I getting a phone call? And in the future, they're even thinking about saying, we can let the oncologist even pick the threshold. Are they worried when the patient's at 100.4 or 101, right? So you got to make those decisions up front and get the strategy right up front around how do you take this ecosystem approach, how do you bring the right kind of flexibility so that you can be successful in the long term, right? And again, I'm really excited that we're seeing companies, even though we see examples of people making those mistakes, we're seeing great examples in really important areas of companies being a lot more thoughtful about how to generate an ecosystem approach. So hopefully those examples become basis for your own thinking. So and I won't read these quotes to you, but we obviously work with a lot of companies, but also have done research, and these are some of the again, I think probably not surprising insights for most of you folks in this room, and I think we can all probably associate with some of our own companies that we've made these mistakes at, and certainly I've had my share of these in the past. So just to close with a couple of recommendations, and then certainly I invite questions and challenge here. So the first point is obviously the one I've been talking about this whole time, which is as you really focus in on the various digital health innovations you're driving at your companies, really ask that question, are we taking an ecosystem approach, right? It doesn't have to be in your MVP, but you got to be doing your innovation in the context of something that is really set up for scale and success, and that's all about ecosystem, right? The second point is, and this is related to that, is by definition, if you're going to be part of an ecosystem, you got to think about partnership. Right? And our challenge that I would ask you to take back is challenge yourselves to, are we only doing the things that we have to do, that we are the best at doing? And if you're working on parts of your solution that you are not the best at doing and you aren't the only ones that can do it, ask yourself why. Should there not be a partner, technology or otherwise, that you should be working with? Because if you are doing that, almost by default, you're setting yourself up to be part of an ecosystem versus creating a silo. And if you're not doing that, it's probably a good litmus test that you're likely creating a siloed solution that's going to be hard to scale down the road. The other key argument that I think plays really well, and certainly we see this in some of the joint work we're beginning to do with BCG and BCG-DV, is this notion of when you have resources that you want to deploy on digital innovation, you want to deploy those on the actual innovation and not sort of have those be spread thin across underlying infrastructure that, again, you can partner versus trying to build and maintain yourself. And again, we're seeing a lot of the thoughtful companies really make that distinction to say, let's focus on the core innovation instead of all of the underlying plumbing that we need to support this. And then lastly, as a table stakes requirement, when you're innovating in the space we are, right? When you're going to a patient, both from a safety and risk management perspective, as well as you're asking them to trust you with their most sensitive data, you got to always start on day one thinking about, do I have the most robust infrastructure I'm using from a privacy, security, and regulatory perspective, and ensure that you're driving your innovation on top of that kind of really strong foundation. So I will pause there. Happy to take questions, comments, challenges. Dr. Tuckerson.
Good. The floor is open for questions. And who is first? Any questions, or is it pretty straightforward?
I have a comment.
Oh, good.
So all points very well taken, Kal. And
maybe just say your name and where you see me. Yeah.
Sorry, this is I'm Simi Kazmi. I'm from Novartis. But before I joined pharma, I was in the tech world and in the consumer space. And the big difference I've found is that the digital health kind of products that are patient-facing, HCP-facing, these are more, these need a consumer sensibility, not an IT sensibility. So in tech companies, the IT departments, which are fantastic and important, focus on services and enterprise level stuff. And the engineering is done by a product-based organization. What I found in pharma is that our product is the molecule, and there is no organization which is product-faced for digital technology stuff. So they struggle with, should we plug it into IT? Should we try to build it up ourselves? And that's where, and there isn't the skill set to build it yourself. That'll take a lot of investment. You have to turn into a tech company to do that. And that's where I see the people like BrightInsight and other players come in and become the true partners. So.
Well stated. Well stated. Do you want to comment back?
Well, I was just going to say, it's a great point, and I think there's going to be a whole panel that Jazz and Diana are going to be talking about a little bit, on the CIO panel, and I think that's going to be definitely one of the things they're going to touch upon is how do you make that transition? What are the options and what are the learnings?
Good. Question here?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Saqib Ibrahim. I'm a physician executive in the digital health space, and you mentioned the ecosystem approach multiple times, and I was wondering if you might be able to comment a little bit about what have been the challenges that have actually prevented an ecosystem from developing, and if you could talk about a success story of actually making that happen, and what were the underlying foundation that allowed that to occur?
Yeah, good question. So this is my experience, my perspective. So welcome others to add to that. So I think a whole bunch of fundamental challenges. One of them has been that pharma and medtech companies historically actually have been quite siloed organizations. Like they sort of have wanted to if it's not invented here kind of mentality to a lot of capabilities. Certainly from a flex perspective, where we work across 12 of the biggest industries in the world, we see that it's the least outsourced industry, right? When you think about the manufacturing of the devices, of the drugs, et cetera, it's the most vertically integrated industry of virtually any industry in the world, right? You think about shoes or clothes or TVs, et cetera. So there's a culture of that, first of all, right? I think the second part has been around this what Simi said, which is the the people who work there, because it requires such a deep experience of having gone to school for a long time to deeply understand science or medicine, et cetera, they're folks who typically have that consumer-facing technology experience when they think about this type of innovation. And the third is the infrastructure. There hasn't been the infrastructure, particularly from a privacy and security and regulatory perspective, which is obviously why we move in with BrightInsight. But when you don't have that infrastructure, you're forced to create point-to-point solutions, right? And that was my own experience at Amgen. And this is all, nothing here is proprietary, but and it's the same experience many of you are having, which is, hey, I got this great innovation. Well, now I got to go and talk to every single health system to try to get it into their workflow. Or I have this great innovation, but how do I get patient identifiable information so I can really personalize the recommendation to that patient, right? So you run into all of these walls that make the technology innovations actually the easiest part. Sometimes the consumer innovation, if you can find the right people, it can be relatively easy because a lot of industries have figured that out as well. But the privacy, security, and regulatory, there's no shortcuts around that, right? And so that becomes this sort of really rate-limiting step. So that gets to your point around the success stories. I wish I had a better example to speak on that. I think unfortunately, I think the real scale examples are yet to come of truly disruptive innovations that have really scaled. The ones that have found are really actually siloed solutions. I realize I'm talking about ecosystem, because there are certain situations where a silo can work. So some of the early stuff, Medtronic was doing in the implanted cardiac space. When you think about what happened in the CPAP space for people with sleep apnea, where basically a reimbursement change forced all the companies to prove that patients were using their CPAP machines. But those were sort of scaled in terms of millions of patients and some improvement, obviously, in clinical outcomes, but they haven't integrated that data back into holistic management of that patient.
I think we can squeeze one quick one in real quick.
Yeah, okay.
I kind of have a
Just
question.
Heidi, name and company, Heidi. Yeah.
So my name is Heidi Dose. I'm with the Google Cloud Healthcare Life Sciences team. And we're talking a lot about ecosystems. And when we talk about the patient journey, the ecosystem, so I'm a professional heart patient. And so I look at this as, I've got my implantable device, my wearable device information, and then the sensors that are in my environmental ecosystem. And right now, most of healthcare is focused on the ecosystem that is important to the healthcare environment. Mm-hmm. But as a patient, what we want most is to get our lives back. Mm-hmm. And that is all the data that's collected in the context of living our lives, which is a lot of our wearables and consumer. And so I'm hoping, and this is why I'm such a big fan of the BrightInsight platform, is can we start to begin to bring that whole picture into focus, make that data actionable for the different stakeholders.
Terrific question.
Yeah. Now I'll respond really briefly by saying, again, I think we're really excited to have Kelly close here, and I think she'll, like you as a patient, touch upon that point, right? But you're exactly right. I mean, we all, again, you guys know the data. The amount of time you spend in the healthcare environment versus the rest of your life, hopefully, is 0.01% to 99.9% if you're lucky to have that. And so this comes back to that Netflix and GPS, Venmo examples, right? It's don't just think about the healthcare ecosystem. You got to start there, but then you got to be taking that broader lens. I think it's a great point.
Terrific.